Today we're going to talk about Elon Musk's debut into politics and the truth about Republican claims that Democrats could have passed pediatric cancer research funding all along. And I've got two interviews. I talked to Senator Brian Schatz about Trump's extreme cabinet nominees and how Democrats should message moving forward. And I'm joined by David Hogg, the co-founder of March for Our Lives, about his run for DNC vice chair. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're watching No Lie. So a lot has happened in the last few days with the government narrowly avoiding a shutdown, but as expected, there is now a ton of misinformation and disinformation surrounding Elon Musk and pediatric cancer research funding. So here's what actually happened. Democrats and Republicans had initially negotiated a CR, a continuing resolution, as a stopgap measure to keep the government funded and open. Pretty standard stuff. At the 11th hour, President Musk decided to swoop in and run a 20-hour scorched earth pressure campaign torching that bill, torching the continued resolution. Why? Probably because he's desperate for attention and power, and he wanted to flex and show that he could. And shockingly, Trump was perfectly content to cede the spotlight to Elon, which I guess is what $400 billion buys you. So now Republicans have to scramble because Elon says that he'll fund primary challengers to anyone who doesn't toe the line of Dear Leader and his human checkbook. Republicans introduce then a new bill after Elon demanded cuts, only this one stripped a bunch of massively important and bipartisan healthcare provisions from that initial bill, like the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act 2.0, which allocated 7 more years of research funding into pediatric cancer. There was also a lot of other provisions, including the Give Kids a Chance Act, which provides for pediatric studies of new cancer drugs, the Innovations in Pediatric Drugs Act, which provides penalties when drug companies don't complete their required pediatric studies, which is usually not as lucrative, the Accelerating Access to Care Act, which streamlines out-of-state treatment for medically complex kids on Medicaid, the Support Act, which promotes opioid recovery and treatment, restrictions on pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, who are basically just middlemen that exist to jack up prices for patients, and the list goes on and on. But the point is that a bunch of healthcare-related provisions were excised from that CR, and Elon applauded the new slimmed-down version. In other words, had it not been for Elon Musk, there would still be pediatric cancer funding along with all of these other healthcare provisions in the bill. That is what Elon did in his political debut. He attacked a bipartisan CR, forced cuts, and applauded a new bill that basically said, fuck kids with cancer. And of course, predictably, that rubbed everybody pretty terribly. Senator Brian Schatz, who, again, incidentally, you'll hear from in a few minutes as one of my guests this week, took to Twitter writing, fuck cancer, especially pediatric cancer. These people want to punish these precious little kids to pay for tax cuts for the wealthiest corporations in human history. And you might have heard this response from Chris Hayes on air.
They cut nearly $200 million in funding for, ready for this, childhood cancer research called the Gabriella Miller Kids First Pediatric Research Program. That's what they cut. That program was established on a bipartisan basis under President Obama. Former Republican leader Eric Cantor was one of the driving forces behind it. Republicans tore the funding for that program out of the bill, seemingly at random, because Elon Musk told them to. So I want to be clear about what's happened, what's transpired in the last 24 hours, okay? The richest man in the world, worth $250 billion, took $190 million away from kids with cancer. That's not hyperbole. It's not exaggeration. That is what has happened.
Now, did Elon go in and tell the authors to strip childhood cancer research funding from this bill? I can't say one way or the other. But what is clear is that there would have been child cancer research funding had it not been for Elon, who expressly called for cuts and then applauded them when they were enacted. So if you're looking for the person responsible here, you found him. Which led to a chorus of Elon fanboys and right-wing provocateurs on Twitter and throughout the right-wing media ecosystem pointing out that the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act 2.0 was passed by the Republican House earlier this year and that it languished in the Democrat-controlled Senate, and that in fact if Democrats wanted this bill so badly, they should have just brought it up for a vote. And that's a nice talking point, and it makes sense on its face, but the way the Senate works is that unless the bill passes with what's called unanimous consent, meaning everybody votes in favor of it, then even a single senator can object. That means that with a bill like this, where otherwise there would be 99 votes in favor, it could still take weeks of Senate time to pass. It eats up valuable floor time for an otherwise uncontroversial bill. And that floor time comes at the expense of other priorities, like, for example, confirming judges. And the Democrats just confirmed 235 judges. That's one more than Trump confirmed in his first term. Here's Sheldon Whitehouse explaining how precious floor time is in the context of getting judges confirmed.
I also want to thank Chuck Schumer, because getting them through committee only gets you half the way. You need to give the floor time to get the votes. And nothing is more precious to a majority leader than floor time. So Chuck dedicating the floor time to this project has really been significant.
Quote, you need to give the floor time to get the votes, and nothing is more precious to a majority leader than floor time to do that. And so you can see how spending 30 hours, for example, debating an uncontroversial pediatric cancer research funding bill has an opportunity cost on the Senate floor, since Republican senators like Rand Paul, who, by the way, did object to this bill, and that's why this bill had not previously passed with unanimous consent, he can then use that to hold precious Democratic floor time hostage. So, instead, Democrats use their floor time for judges, knowing full well that they could simply add this very bipartisan, very uncontroversial bill to the omnibus package at the end of the year. And that's exactly what they did. And this isn't new. This happens every year. It is completely normal. So they go ahead and they add it to the bipartisan continuing resolution. And because it's childhood cancer funding, of course it should go into the CR. That is exactly why it's there, to catch up on the priorities that Congress didn't have the dozens of hours to burn, but that clearly have enough support from both parties that it should pass with no problem. All of which is to say, no, this isn't some example of Schumer torpedoing kids' cancer research funding. Schumer knew that if it couldn't pass by unanimous consent, which it couldn't, then he could simply put it in the continuing resolution at the end of the year, and that is exactly what he did. Meaning the only person here who was actually responsible for stripping pediatric cancer research funding from this bill was President Musk. And that's what he decided to do with his official debut into politics, again, to be the reason that childhood cancer research was not funded. This is what you get with Republican leadership. You get an unelected oligarch in Elon Musk who is so aggressively out of touch that he would take an axe to cancer research funding, and you get a senator like Rand Paul who would object to this and block it from being passed by unanimous consent in the Senate prior to that. Now, luckily, the Senate was ultimately able to pass the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act 2.0 by unanimous consent in the Senate as a standalone bill, but only after Democratic Senator Tim Kaine got Republican Senator Rand Paul to finally drop his objection. That's the only reason that this funding is ultimately going to go through. After the Republican human wallet got it stripped from the CR. That is the only reason that this funding is going to be allocated, and that's because of Democrats. Something to remember the next time that Republicans claim to be pro-children or pro-life. Next up are previews my interviews with Brian Schatz and David Hogg, but first just a quick note, if you are new to this podcast, this is the video version podcast of No Lie. There is also an audio version podcast. The audio version just became part of the Crooked Media family. So No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen is now part of Crooked Media, which is exciting for me because Pod Save America, which is on Crooked Media, has always been a huge inspiration of mine. Part of signing on with Crooked Media means that this show has sponsors on the audio podcast, and as such, it also has sponsors on the video version of this podcast. So in one video per week, there will be sponsors on this channel. So with that said, here's a quick word from a sponsor, and then we'll get into the previews of my interviews with Brian Schatz and David Hogg. No Lie is brought to you by ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol. If politics didn't already make me feel old enough, there is also the fact that when I drink, I do not bounce back the next day like I used to, until I found pre-alcohol. So here's the deal. ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol Probiotic Drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make pre-alcohol your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. The reality is that when I have pre-alcohol before drinks, I notice a difference the next day. Even after a night out, I can still get in front of the camera without worry, and that's legitimately not something I'd been able to do before. So look, the holiday season's upon us. We're going to be consuming a bit more alcohol than usual. Pre-alcohol helps you stay on track and not let the season throw you off course. Go to zbiotics.com/BTC to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use BTC at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/BTC and use the code BTC at checkout for 15% off. I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of our language, right? We speak in a way that's safe, inoffensive, uncontroversial, and I think that's in large part owed to the fact that this is the Big Ten party. This is the party that focuses on people who are marginalized or largely left behind, and so that informs in large part how we speak to folks, because you don't want to say the same things that certain folks on the right can say, and they don't have to worry about blowback because it's well, at least before this election, a largely homogenous group of people. So how do you kind of square those two things, where you want to have language that sounds human, that appeals to regular people, but at the same time, when you make sure that you appeal to so many people within such a broad tent, so like such a large swath of people out there, you have to do it in a way that I think isn't going to offend anyone. So have you thought about that as like the Democratic Party's predicament more broadly?
Maybe. I mean, first of all, I'm not sure that it's like impossible to find a way to sound normal without offending someone. Like, we can sound normal. We can sound like a regular person and still not like offend part of our coalition. There's a way to be kind. There's a way to appreciate diversity without sounding like you just got, spit out of a faculty lounge and and you've like learned a bunch of, or you're 19 and you're learning a bunch of new language about the world and you're like road testing it. So I'm not sure I accept the premise that like it's some super high degree of difficulty thing to like talk normally. I just think if we started to talk normally, that would do like 80% of it. But there's another part of this, Brian, that you might be, I think, underestimating, which is it's also just pollsters, right? And this is, I want to be very clear. Pollsters didn't ask for this like apex position in Democratic strategy, but they now have it. I've seen this in the climate space. I've seen this in the civil rights space. They will test a particular proposition like 3 or 4 different ways. Like, here's the way to say it that polls the best, right? And often that is the way to say it that offends the least people, because you get somebody who maybe isn't actually sympathetic to your point of view, but if you say it in a certain way, it may be hidden enough that they go like, yeah, I'm fine with that. So the thing polls at 71, 29 rather than 65, 35, whatever the heck it is, right? And I think the problem with that is that, given that one of our most basic problems is that we don't penetrate into whole universes of people, because we're not saying things that are interesting. If you have a captive audience and you ask 100 people, 70 out of 100 are going to go like, yeah, that's the least offensive way to phrase that. But one of the I think, talents that Donald Trump has is to say things in maybe ways that are a little offensive, but they are interesting enough that they penetrate. Now, I don't think we should go out of our way to say things wacky, but I do think we need to calibrate this question of like, oh, this poll's at 65, not 62, to, okay, but does the 65 one sound like a person? Or do you sound like you're like AI spitting out a recommendation? And I think a lot of times we sound like we are actually trying to dodge angry people. And I think we just have to get a little more comfortable, just saying what we think. And I just remember when Trump tried to institute the Muslim ban, we had a bunch of pollsters come to us and say, hey, you might want to be careful about this because it's actually polling, relatively strongly. And Booker and Murphy and a number of others and I basically told these people to fuck off. And we fought the Muslim ban. And you know what happened is the numbers moved because people want to hear the argument. And they're lacking an argument. People are going to agree with whatever's sort of, not all of them, but people are going to agree with some whatever's presented to them. And I think that's one of the lessons here is that it's important to get public opinion data, but our job is to move public opinion, not just to follow it.
The elephant in the room in terms of Democratic leadership is that this party is largely a gerontocracy. I mean, we have for a party that claims the majority of support, not enough, but the majority of support among young people, the fact that we have such an old leadership class, I think is is a major cause for concern here, and probably the reason why there is so little ability to relate to the issues plaguing regular people, whether it's housing costs, whether it's just regular costs of living. So how do you plan on navigating what is going to be an environment that's hostile to young people? You're in your mid-20s. So how do you plan to navigate this environment that is inherently hostile to young people, that's shown it's hostile to young people in light of your run for vice chair of the DNC?
I mean, to be honest with you, it's not easy. This is one of the toughest things that I've done, because you're not, it's one thing to be questioned and criticized by Republicans. It's another thing to be questioned by the people that are on your side. Right. I know why I'm in this. I did not choose to be involved in Democratic politics. I was forced into it because of the fact that we don't have a choice of whether or not to make our kids safe in our schools. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I know that if I don't do this, there are a few other people of my age that actually could, that can have the voice, that can raise the money, that can get into those rooms and can speak out. And I need to make sure that I'm working to open that door and keeping it open for other young people into the future. And with that too, realizing that I'm the underdog in this race, but I'm not going to try to contort myself and say, well, I'm going to twist myself in all these different ways to try to earn your vote and all these other things. But the reality is we need some serious changes. And I think anybody that can't see that is part of the problem. And I understand that may cost me votes, but I would much rather tell people what I am actually feeling than feed them bullshit talking points over and over and over again that are part of the reason why we've got here. I'm not scripted. Sometimes that's a disadvantage, but the reality is at least you know what I'm feeling and you know why I'm in it. It's because of what we saw yesterday in Wisconsin. It's because of what we see every day in our country. In my own, where I live, right? I know the stats. I know that gun violence has come down. I know that it's gone down by over 10% in the past 4 years. But the reality is, in my own neighborhood, there have been, in the past 6 months, 2 drive-by shootings that happened, right? And carjackings that have happened, and cars being dropped off after they were carjacked. I know the stats, but I know that the answer to somebody to my neighbor is not to say, no, you don't understand. That drive-by shooting that woke up, your partner at 2 a.m. the other night wasn't that bad because crime's actually down 10%. What we need to do is bring people in that are working outside of the Beltway. I'm traveling constantly with the work I'm doing with Leaders We Deserve to elect more young people, knocking doors, not in blue states, not just in blue states, not just in purple states, but in states as red as Alabama, where our first race was, where I was knocking doors in Birmingham, Alabama, right? Not easy conversations to have, but those are the conversations we need to, because we can either choose to continue to live as increasingly the party of the consulting class or become the party of the working class by actually listening to people. And it's not to say that I'm perfect or that, frankly, that I know every single thing and how to fix it perfectly. I'd be lying to you if I said that I did, but the reality is I know how to listen. And I think that's half the battle right now.
And of course, to watch the full reviews with Brian Schatz and David Hogg, click the thumbnails right here on the screen or check out the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel. You can also click the link on the screen to listen to the audio version of this episode, and of course, to see more of my content, the subscribe button's on the screen as well.